The little black girl knocked beside the boiler hall, telling the biker someone forced her mom into a locked supply cage. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. It was a late afternoon. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the old, rundown building. The sound of distant voices and the hum of machinery echoed through the narrow alley next to the factory. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust, typical of an industrial district that had long since fallen out of use. But in that moment, everything felt silent, almost too silent. That was when the door to the back of the boiler hall burst open, and a small figure emerged, her arms flailing as she ran. A young black girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, was desperately trying to catch her breath as tears streamed down her face. She was barefoot, her dress torn at the hem, and her tiny body was trembling with fear. Her face was streaked with dirt, and she looked like she had been running for miles. Her eyes were wide with panic, and she was clearly in distress. The girl was heading straight for a group of bikers who had just finished unloading their bikes from a nearby parking lot. As she reached them, she collapsed to the ground, her knees giving way under the strain of the run. The nearest biker, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scruffy beard, knelt down to help her. "Hey, kid, are you all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but filled with concern. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and frantic. "Please, you have to help me," she gasped, her voice shaking. "Someone took my mom. They locked her in a supply cage. Please, you have to help." The biker's expression changed instantly. He could tell this wasn't just some harmless situation. Something was terribly wrong. The rest of the bikers gathered around, each of them sensing the urgency of the situation. "Who did this to your mom, kid?" the biker asked softly, trying to keep his voice calm. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her tiny frame shaking with fear. "I don't know," she said in between sobs. He came and took her. He said she was a prisoner, but I don't know what he meant. I tried to stop him, but I couldn't." The bikers exchanged concerned glances. They were no strangers to danger, but this was different. This wasn't just some random act of violence. It was personal, and they weren't going to let this child suffer alone. "All right," the biker said, standing up and signaling to his crew. "We're going to get your mom back. Don't worry, kid. You're safe now." The girl looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she whispered. The group of bikers, all with years of experience and a shared code of loyalty, knew they had no choice but to act. They had no idea what they were walking into, but they couldn't stand by while an innocent child was caught in the middle of something much bigger than herself. The engine roared to life as the bikers mounted their bikes and revved them up. The sound of the motorcycles echoed down the alley as they sped off, following the girl's directions to the abandoned building where her mother was being held. As they approached the building, the air grew tense. No one spoke, but everyone knew this was going to be more than just a rescue mission. This was going to be a fight, and they were ready to face whatever came their way. The engines of the motorcycles roared to life, cutting through the eerie silence of the industrial district. The bikers, their faces set with determination, formed a tight formation, following the young girl's trembling finger pointing toward the old, run-down warehouse. The smell of rust and old grease hung in the air as the group sped down the narrow alley, the thrum of the bikes vibrating in their chests. They were prepared for anything. Their leader, the tall, broad-shouldered man from earlier, glanced over at the girl, who was now sitting behind him, clutching his leather vest with her small hands. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We'll get your mom back. Just hold on." The girl nodded, her face pale and streaked with tears, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes. It was the first sign of relief she had shown since she ran into their camp. As they approached the entrance of the dilapidated building, the sun had completely set, and the only light came from the faint glow of street lamps and the headlights of their motorcycles. The building loomed ahead, its windows shattered, the walls covered in grime, and the air thick with the smell of neglect. The bikers slowed down, coming to a halt just outside the entrance. The leader signaled to his crew. "Stay sharp," he whispered. "We don't know what we're walking into, but this ends tonight." The group nodded, their faces hardening as they dismounted from their bikes and surveyed the area. They moved quickly, yet cautiously, toward the building's entrance. The girl, still shaken but trying to keep it together, led them forward. "It's this way," she said in a barely audible voice. Her hand pointed toward a rusty metal door at the far side of the building. The bikers, their leather jackets reflecting the dim light, moved in unison, each step taken with purpose. They reached the door, and the leader gently pushed it open. The creak of the door echoed through the empty warehouse, and the smell of mold and decay hit them all at once. The inside was just as grim as the outside, with broken machinery scattered across the floor and dust covering everything in sight. In the far corner, they could see a faint light flickering from under a door. The leader nodded to his team. "That's where she is," he said. Without hesitation, the crew moved toward the door. As they got closer, they could hear muffled voices coming from the other side. The leader's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the tension building as they inched closer to the source of the sounds. He motioned for the team to stop. "Everyone ready?" he asked in a low voice. They nodded. The leader stepped forward and pushed the door open. What they saw on the other side froze them in place. The girl's mother, a thin woman with a pale face, was sitting in the corner of the room, her hands bound to a chair, her eyes wide with fear. Standing in front of her was a man, his back turned to the door, his hands resting on his hips. He was tall, with dark hair and a hardened look. The bikers exchanged glances. They didn't recognize him, but they could tell from his posture that he was the one in charge. "Let her go," the leader said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much to back down now. The man turned around slowly, a smirk crossing his face as he sized them up. "I don't think you're in a position to make demands," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. The bikers stood their ground, not moving an inch. The leader took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "We're not leaving until she's free. Now let her go, or we'll make you." The man's smirk faded, replaced with a look of annoyance. "You think you can intimidate me?" he said, his voice turning cold. "I know who you are, and I don't fear you or your gang. You've got no business here." The leader's hand tightened around the handle of his leather jacket, the tension in the room thickening. He was ready to fight. But then, the girl's voice broke through the silence. "Please," she cried out. "Just let her go. She's my mom." The man glanced at the girl, his eyes narrowing. He took a step toward her, his face twisting with anger. "Your mom is worthless," he spat. "She owes me money. And now, she's going to pay for it." The biker's anger flared, but the leader held them back with a sharp motion. He took a deep breath and stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "No one hurts a woman like that, and no one threatens a kid on my watch. We're walking out of here with her, and if you try to stop us, it's not going to end well for you." The man sneered, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He knew he was outnumbered, and for the first time, he began to realize that this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. The bikers moved forward in unison, their determination clear. This was not just a rescue mission. It was a stand against everything he represented. And tonight we're going to make sure the girl's mother was safe, no matter the cost. The man stepped back, his eyes shifting between the bikers and the mother still bound in the chair. His bravado began to waver, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You think you can just walk in here and take her?" he spat, glancing toward the door as though expecting someone to come to his aid. But the bikers were unfazed. The leader, his jaw set and his eyes locked onto the man, took another step forward. "We've already made our decision. Let her go, and you walk away with your life. Try anything else, and you won't be so lucky." The tension in the room was suffocating. The rest of the bikers stood firm, eyes never leaving the man, their hands hovering near the weapons they kept hidden beneath their jackets. The leader knew that the man wasn't just some random thug. The way he held himself, the way he spoke, this was someone with power, someone who had likely made many enemies. But that didn't matter. Not now. What mattered was the little girl, terrified and alone, standing by his side. Her mother had been taken, and these bikers were the only ones who would fight to bring her home. The man's smirk faltered as he took another glance at the girl. She was still sobbing quietly, her small hands clenched tightly around the leader's leather vest. "Please," the girl whimpered. Don't hurt my mom. The leader turned to her, his face softening for just a moment. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but firm. We're not going to let anything happen to her. I promise. The man's eyes flickered with anger, then back to the bikers. You don't know what you're dealing with. You think you can just waltz in here, and everything will be fine? You don't know who I am. I don't care who you are, the leader replied, his voice growing colder. You've hurt someone innocent. That's all I need to know. And you're not walking out of here without facing the consequences. The man's hand twitched toward his pocket, but the leader was faster. In an instant, the sound of metal being drawn echoed through the room, and the man froze. The leader's gaze was sharp, like a predator's, as he leveled his knife at the man's throat. Move again, and it's over, he said, his voice a low growl. The man's expression shifted. For a brief moment, doubt crept into his eyes. You don't have the guts, he sneered, but the leader's unflinching stance said otherwise. I don't need guts. I just need you to understand that we're not here to negotiate. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. The rest of the bikers began to move into position, creating a wall of leather and muscle between the man and the mother. There was nowhere for him to go, no way out. With a deep breath, the man stepped back, his hands raised in mock surrender. Fine, he muttered. Take her. But this isn't over. It is for you, the leader replied, motioning to one of the bikers to cut the mother's restraints. The biker stepped forward, a large, burly man with a face full of scars. He made quick work of the ropes binding the woman's wrists and gently helped her to her feet. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was a flicker of gratitude in them as she looked up at the bikers. She collapsed into her daughter's arms, who held her tightly, both of them shaking. You're safe now, the leader said, his voice softening as he turned back to the man. Get out, and don't come back. The man hesitated for a moment, his fists clenching, but he saw the resolve in the biker's eyes and knew he wouldn't win this fight. With a final sneer, he turned and stalked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. As the door slammed shut behind him, the bikers exhaled a collective breath. The tension that had been hanging in the air like a storm cloud finally began to dissipate. The leader turned to the woman and her daughter, his voice gentle. You're safe now. Let's get you out of here. The mother nodded, her voice weak but filled with relief. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea how much this means to me. The leader gave a small nod, his eyes softening as he watched the girl's mother hug her tightly. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would be more obstacles ahead, more people to face. But for now, they had won. They had brought the girl's mother back to her, and that was what mattered. As the bikers gathered around, ready to leave the crumbling warehouse behind, the leader took one last look at the door the man had walked through. This isn't over, he muttered to himself. Not by a long shot. The bikers stood in a tight formation, their leather jackets glistening under the dim lights of the warehouse. The tension from their confrontation with the man was still thick in the air, but the mission was far from over. The girl and her mother were now safe, but the leader knew there was something more behind the scene they had just walked into. They weren't just dealing with one man. They were dealing with a much larger problem, a network of people who had been operating in the shadows, using their power to hurt others without consequence. The mother, still shaken but slowly regaining her composure, clung to her daughter. The little girl looked up at the leader with a mixture of fear and trust. He gave her a reassuring smile, trying to ease her mind. You're safe now, he said softly, though he knew the real danger was still lurking. The rest of the bikers gathered around, checking the perimeter, ensuring no one was coming to retaliate. The leader, his jaw set and his thoughts racing, turned to one of his most trusted members, a tall man named Storm who had a sharp eye for details. Storm, keep an eye on that door. We're not out of the woods yet. Storm nodded, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. The leader looked back at the mother and daughter. We need to move quickly. This place isn't safe. They'll come after us, and when they do, we won't have much time to react. Get on the bikes, all of you. We're leaving now. The mother nodded, but the girl clung to her tighter, hesitant to let go. Don't worry, the leader reassured them. We'll get you somewhere safe. As the bikers prepared to leave, the engine roared to life, breaking the silence of the warehouse. The sound echoed through the building as they sped out into the night. The streets outside were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The leader led the way, his bike cutting through the cool night air. The rest of the group followed in tight formation, making sure the mother and daughter were protected at all costs. The journey ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. As they rode down the winding road, the leader's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just a single man holding a woman hostage. There were bigger players involved, and the bikers had unknowingly just stepped into a war zone. They had rescued the woman, but the stakes were far higher than they had imagined. The girl's voice broke through his thoughts. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. The leader turned his head slightly, offering her a small smile. "Somewhere safe," he said, his voice steady. "Somewhere they can't hurt you or your mom anymore." The girl nodded, but the fear still lingered in her eyes. It was clear that this wasn't just about physical safety. She was scared, and the leader knew it wasn't just the immediate danger that had shaken her. She had witnessed something horrible, and it would take more than just distance to erase the fear from her heart. They rode for miles, heading away from the city and into the countryside. The wind was picking up, and the night air grew colder as they left the industrial district behind. The leader's mind kept returning to the conversation he'd had with the man inside the warehouse. "You don't know who I am," the man had said, "but I'm pretty sure I know who you are." The words echoed in his mind, making him uneasy. The bikers were no strangers to danger, but this felt different. The man hadn't been scared of them. In fact, he had seemed almost too calm. It was as if he knew something the bikers didn't. And that, more than anything, troubled the leader. As they neared a small, secluded farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the leader motioned for the group to slow down. They would stay here for the night, regroup, and figure out their next move. The bikers circled the farmhouse, their bikes shutting off one by one. The sound of the engines fading into the night was replaced by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. The leader got off his bike, motioning for the others to follow. "Let's get inside. We'll make sure the place is secure, then we can talk." Inside, the house was dark, but the place was sturdy enough to offer them some shelter. The leader walked over to the small kitchen and began making a pot of coffee. He needed to think. The others gathered around the table, their faces filled with the same unease. They all knew that the battle was far from over. "What do you think this is about?" one of the bikers, a woman named Crow, asked. "Why did he say he knew us?" The leader paused, staring into the dark coffee as the steam rose from the mug. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I have a feeling we're about to find out. And when we do, it's not going to be pretty." The room fell silent as the bikers exchanged wary glances. They were all hardened by years on the road, by fights and losses. But something about this felt different. Something was coming, and they weren't ready for it. Not yet. The next morning, the sound of birds chirping outside the farmhouse was the only sign of life. Inside, the bikers were still on edge, though the tension had eased somewhat from the night before. The leader stood by the window, his eyes scanning the horizon as the first light of dawn slowly crept over the distant hills. He had hardly slept. His mind kept racing, replaying the events of the previous night, the conversation with the man, and the unsettling feeling that had settled in his chest. Something about all of this didn't sit right. The others were just starting to stir, some making coffee, others checking their bikes and equipment. The mother and daughter were still asleep, though the leader noticed the girl had moved closer to her mother in the night, as if seeking comfort from the lingering fear. As the leader turned away from the window, he was met with the concerned looks of his crew. Storm, his second in command, approached, his brow furrowed. "You're not feeling this, are you?" he asked, his voice low. The leader exhaled slowly. "No, I'm not," he replied, rubbing his face as if trying to shake off the feeling. "That man last night, he wasn't afraid of us. That's not normal." "You think he was connected to something bigger?" Storm asked, his tone cautious. The leader nodded. "Yeah, I don't think this was just about a random hostage situation. We've seen the signs before. This is bigger, Storm. Much bigger." Storm grunted, understanding exactly what the leader was hinting at. They had faced threats from powerful people before, but nothing like this. This felt personal, and they weren't sure yet who the enemy was. "So what now?" Storm asked. The leader sighed, looking over at the door where the mother and daughter were still sleeping. "We stay put for now. We can't afford to keep moving without knowing who we're up against. We need to get more intel, find out who that guy really is, and why he was so sure we'd back off. The rest of the crew gathered around the table, their eyes tired but alert. The leader looked around, making eye contact with each of them. We can't keep running. We don't know who we're dealing with, but one thing's clear. They know us, and they won't stop until they get what they want. The tension in the room grew heavier, but no one spoke. Everyone knew the leader was right. This wasn't just about a rescue mission anymore. They were caught in the middle of something far more dangerous. The leader turned to one of the bikers, a woman named Raven, who had always been sharp with her instincts. Raven, any ideas? Raven took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing. We need to find out who that guy works for, what his connections are. It's the only way we'll know how deep this goes. The leader nodded. Exactly. But we can't rush in blind. We need to be smart about this. He paused for a moment, thinking. I'll reach out to some old contacts, see if they know anything. In the meantime, we stay here and lay low. If anyone tries to track us, they won't find anything. The group nodded in agreement, though the unease remained. Everyone could feel the weight of what was to come. The leader glanced at the door again, his thoughts returning to the mother and daughter. They had done what they came here to do, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of something much darker. As the hours passed, the bikers stayed vigilant, watching the surrounding area and making sure no one was approaching. The mother and daughter remained inside, trying to rest and recover from the harrowing experience they'd just gone through. But the leader knew that no amount of rest could erase the fear that would likely haunt them for a long time. Finally, just before noon, the leader stepped outside, pulling his phone from his pocket. He dialed a number, waiting as it rang. When it finally connected, a gravelly voice answered. What do you need, Forge? The voice asked. Forge, the leader, leaned against the side of the farmhouse, his eyes scanning the horizon once more. I need information. We're in the middle of something, and I don't like not knowing who I'm dealing with. Can you help me out? The voice on the other end paused before responding. I'll see what I can find. But you need to be careful. These people you're dealing with aren't playing around. Forge's grip on the phone tightened. I know. I need to find out who's behind all this before it gets worse. The voice on the other end let out a low sigh. You're playing with fire, Forge. But I'll do what I can. Just don't get too deep in it. I'll get back to you. The line went dead. Forge put his phone away, his mind already working through the possibilities. There was no way around it. They had to face whatever was coming, and they had to face it head on. As he turned back toward the farmhouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too deep into something that would take everything they had to survive. But there was no turning back now. The war had already begun. The sun was starting to set as the bikers remained stationed around the farmhouse, keeping watch for any signs of trouble. It had been several hours since Forge had made the call, and still no word. The tension was growing. The mother and daughter were inside, trying to get some rest, but the fear in their eyes hadn't gone away. The leader, Forge, was pacing outside, the events of the last few days playing over and over in his mind. He had promised that they would be safe, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was only beginning. His thoughts were interrupted when Storm, his second-in-command, walked over to him. We've got a problem, Storm said, his voice grim. Forge turned to face him, his expression serious. What is it? A couple of bikes just pulled up on the road a few miles down. Looks like they're not just passing through. They're stopping and checking the area, Storm reported. Forge's jaw tightened. How many? At least 5 bikes, maybe more. They're moving fast. Whoever they are, they're looking for something. Forge's mind raced. The man from the warehouse, the one who had threatened them, had mentioned that they weren't the only ones involved. This was bigger than they thought, and the danger was closing in. Forge quickly gathered the group, his voice calm but urgent. We need to move. Now. The bikers immediately sprang into action, preparing their bikes and making sure the mother and daughter were safely hidden inside the farmhouse. As they started the engines and revved up, Forge glanced over his shoulder at the small house. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. The unknown riders were getting closer, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. The group moved out in a tight formation, Forge leading the way. The gravel road was narrow, the tall trees on either side casting long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. They couldn't risk staying out in the open for too long. Forge's eyes scanned the road ahead, every muscle in his body tense, ready for anything. As they rode, the distant sound of motorcycles grew louder. The leader knew that whoever these riders were, they were here for a reason. They had to be. The group reached a fork in the road, and Forge motioned for them to split up. "We'll split into 2 teams," he instructed. "Storm, take the left side and head around the back of the trees. The rest of you, follow me. We'll catch them from the front." Storm nodded and revved his bike as the 2 groups separated, weaving through the dense forest on either side of the road. The leader pushed his bike to its limits, his mind focused on the task ahead. Every instinct told him that they were walking into something dangerous. They could no longer afford to be passive. It was time to face whatever awaited them head-on. As they reached the clearing where the other bikers had been spotted, Forge signaled for the group to slow down. The sound of engines came to a halt, and the group positioned themselves behind the trees, their eyes fixed on the road. It wasn't long before the first of the 5 bikes appeared, cutting through the darkness. The rider was tall and dressed in dark leather, the visor of his helmet reflecting the faint light from the distant farmhouse. Forge's hand tightened on the throttle, preparing for the worst. The other bikers followed in suit, their eyes trained on the approaching figure. As the rider passed, Forge motioned to the group to follow quietly, keeping a safe distance. They rode silently, following the riders through the woods until they reached an abandoned warehouse a few miles down the road. The riders stopped and dismounted, speaking in low voices, too far away to hear their conversation. Forge's instincts told him this was it, the place they had been looking for. It was clear the bikers hadn't just stumbled upon this area by accident. They were searching for something, and they would stop at nothing to find it. Forge signaled to Storm, who was crouched in the shadows, to move in closer. Storm nodded and moved silently, disappearing into the darkness. The leader stayed back, watching the riders, trying to gather any information he could. He needed to understand why they were here and what they were after. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As Storm returned, he motioned for Forge to come closer. "They're setting up camp in the warehouse," Storm whispered. "Looks like they've been here a while. They're definitely expecting something." Forge's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "They've got equipment. It's hidden in the back of the warehouse. They're prepared for something big." Forge thought for a moment. They couldn't stay here for too long. They had to find a way to get inside and figure out what these riders were after. He motioned for the group to gather. "We're going in," Forge said, his voice resolute. "Get your gear ready. We're going to find out what's going on, and we're not leaving without answers." The bikers nodded, their expressions serious. The leader's mind was focused, the mission clear. It wasn't just about saving the mother and daughter anymore. This was about uncovering the truth behind the people who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. They were about to step into a war they didn't fully understand, but they had no choice. The time for waiting was over. It was time to act. The bikers moved into position around the warehouse. Their bikes turned off to avoid drawing attention. The night air was heavy, and the smell of damp wood and rusted metal filled their nostrils. Forge's heart was pounding in his chest, every muscle in his body alert. He glanced over at Storm, who was crouching low, eyes scanning the area. Storm gave a subtle nod, signaling that the coast was clear for now. Forge took a deep breath and motioned for the others to follow. The plan was simple: get inside, gather intel, and get out before anyone noticed they were there. Forge knew the risk. The tension from the previous hours hung thick in the air, but this wasn't just about a rescue mission anymore. They were stepping into a world they didn't understand, facing enemies they hadn't yet fully identified. As they approached the back of the warehouse, Forge whispered to his team, "Stay close. Don't make a sound." The bikers moved like shadows, their footsteps barely audible against the gravel. They reached the entrance without incident, Forge signaling for one of the bikers, Raven, to check the door. Raven, always the quick thinker, moved to the side of the building, finding a broken window just large enough to slip through. She crawled inside, careful not to make a sound, and soon returned with a quiet but urgent message. "It's clear, but we're not the only ones here. There's someone inside, more than one." Forge nodded, feeling his instincts sharpen. "Keep your eyes open. Let's move in." They crept into the building, the darkness inside almost suffocating. The only sounds were the muffled breathing of the team and the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Forge could make out faint shapes in the distance. Boxes stacked high, crates scattered across the floor. The flickering light from a single hanging bulb barely illuminated the far corner, but Forge's eyes adjusted quickly. In the shadows, two figures stood talking, their voices low and menacing. Forge motioned for the team to stop. They had found them. "We need to get closer," he whispered. Storm, always the strategist, nodded. "We should split up and flank them. I'll take the left side, you take the right." The others positioned themselves accordingly, each of them moving silently through the dark, their eyes locked on the two figures in the distance. Forge could hear snippets of their conversation as he crept closer. "They're getting too close. We need to move fast," one of the figures said. "The bikers won't stop until they find us. We've got to make our next move." Forge's grip tightened on the handle of his knife. He didn't know who these people were, but he knew one thing for sure. They were involved in something much bigger than just this. "We can't let them get away," Forge muttered under his breath. The figures, unaware of the approaching bikers, continued to talk. Forge's instincts told him this was the moment they'd been waiting for. He nodded to Storm, who was positioned on the opposite side of the room, signaling for the attack. The bikers surged forward, moving fast, but making sure they didn't alert the two figures until it was too late. Just as the figures turned to see what was happening, Forge and Storm were on them. The two men stumbled back, surprised by the sudden assault. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, his voice filled with a mix of fear and anger. Forge stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "The ones who are going to stop you," he said coldly. "You're not getting away with this." The man reached for his pocket, but Forge was faster. In a swift motion, he grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground. Storm had the other man pinned in seconds, his knee pressing into the man's chest. "Not so fast," Storm growled. The two bikers stood over the men, their eyes hard as they looked down at their captives. "What's going on here?" Forge demanded. "Who are you working for?" The first man sneered, his eyes filled with defiance. "You think we're the ones you should be worried about? You don't even know the half of it." Forge's patience was wearing thin. "Tell me who's behind this," he insisted. "Who sent you?" The man's expression twisted in frustration, but he refused to answer. Forge pressed harder. "You can either tell me, or we'll make you talk." The second man, struggling beneath Storm's grip, managed to choke out a few words. "It's bigger than you think," he rasped. "You don't know who's pulling the strings. You're in over your heads." Storm exchanged a quick glance with Forge. He could tell they weren't getting the answers they needed from these two. "Looks like we're not going to get much out of them," Storm said, frustration evident in his voice. Forge nodded. "We'll have to find another way." He motioned for the group to pull back. They couldn't afford to stay in the warehouse any longer. "Let's go," he ordered. "We've got what we came for. Let's move out before we get any more company." The bikers quickly withdrew, taking the two men with them, but Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they had just scratched the surface of a much larger operation. Whoever was behind this, they weren't just after one woman and her daughter. They were after something far more dangerous. And now, Forge and his crew were in the middle of it. They weren't just rescuing people anymore. They were hunting down a network of criminals that stretched far deeper than they had ever imagined. The bikers sped through the darkened streets, the headlights of their motorcycles cutting through the night like a blade. Forge's mind raced as he led the group down the narrow road that wound through the outskirts of town. They had gotten what they needed from the two men they captured, but the answers were not enough. There was something bigger going on here, something far more dangerous than they had originally realized. As the group rode in silence, Forge's thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation he had overheard inside the warehouse. The cryptic words about being in over their heads echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He had made a promise to the girl and her mother, but now he was beginning to realize that keeping them safe was going to be far more difficult than he had anticipated. The group finally reached the secluded house they had set up as a base of operations. The bikes came to a slow stop as the leader motioned for everyone to dismount. The air was still, the sound of the motorcycles fading into the distance as the bikers gathered around. Forge took a deep breath, trying to push the weight of the situation aside, if only for a moment. He had to think. "We need a plan," Forge said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The crew nodded in agreement, their faces hardening as they listened. Those two men, they didn't just stumble into our path by accident. They were waiting for something or someone. "We don't know who's behind this yet, but we will." He paused, glancing around at his team. "Raven, I need you to dig into their background. Find out who they were talking about, who's pulling the strings. The rest of you, get ready. If these people come after us again, we'll need to be prepared." The bikers immediately went to work, some checking their bikes, others preparing weapons, while Raven began making calls to her own network of contacts. The mother and daughter stayed inside, still recovering from the ordeal they had been through. Forge felt a pang of guilt as he looked at the girl. She had seen too much for someone so young, and he knew that this nightmare was far from over for her. The hours passed slowly, each minute adding to the tension that hung in the air. Finally, Raven returned, a look of grim determination on her face. "I've got something," she said, her voice low. "The 2 men we captured, they were part of a group that's been operating in the area for years. They've been involved in everything from trafficking to extortion. But the real shocker is the leader. His name is Royce Waller, and he's connected to some pretty powerful people." Forge's heart sank. He had feared this. The people they were up against were no small-time criminals. These were the kind of people who could make problems disappear. Royce Waller, Forge muttered, rolling the name around in his mind. "We've got to find him." Raven nodded. "I've already reached out to a few people. We should have an address on him soon." Forge rubbed his eyes, exhaustion starting to take its toll. He had always been the one to keep the team grounded, but now, it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He couldn't let his guard down, not now. "Keep me posted," Forge said to Raven, his voice tight. "If Waller is involved in this, we can't take any chances." The night dragged on as the bikers prepared for what was coming. Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the quiet before the storm was about to end. He kept his eyes on the shadows, every sound causing his muscles to tense. He knew they had to be ready for anything. When the morning finally came, the news they had been waiting for arrived. Raven came into the room, a grim look on her face. "I got the address," she said. "It's a property just outside of town. Looks like a safe house of some sort. It's isolated. No one's going to hear anything that happens there." Forge stood up, his eyes narrowing. "We're going to hit it hard. No hesitation. If we're going to stop this, we need to take down Royce Waller and anyone else who's involved. We can't wait any longer." The bikers quickly mounted their bikes, engines roaring to life once again as they sped down the road toward the safe house. Forge led the charge, his mind focused on the task at hand. This was no longer about just protecting a woman and her daughter. This was about taking down a criminal organization that had been hiding in the shadows for too long. They couldn't afford to hesitate. As they neared the location, Forge's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. They were about to walk into the lion's den. The safe house was located on a dirt road, hidden away behind a cluster of trees. Forge slowed his bike as he neared the entrance, signaling for the group to stay back. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but filled with tension. "Let's move." The bikers dismounted, their steps silent as they approached the building. The air was thick with anticipation. Forge's hand tightened around his weapon as they closed in on the entrance. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins. They were about to face whatever danger lurked inside. No matter what it took, they weren't leaving without answers. The bikers approached the safe house slowly, the trees surrounding the area thick with shadows as the sun began to set, casting an eerie glow over the isolated building. Forge led the way, his mind sharp and focused. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was the final confrontation. The air was still, but there was an undercurrent of tension, thick enough to cut through. They had been tracking this operation for days, and now they were on the brink of taking it down, but Forge knew better than to get overconfident. The night was far from over, and anything could happen. He motioned for his crew to stay low, signaling them to surround the house. The small team split into 2 groups, one to the front, the other to the back. No one spoke, but each of them knew their role. This was their moment. The silence was only broken by the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. As they neared the building, Forge's thoughts raced back to the words of the 2 men they had captured. They weren't just small-time crooks. They were working for something far bigger, far more dangerous. Royce Waller wasn't just some local thug. He was connected, and Forge had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. He could feel the weight of it all, the lives of the mother and daughter, his crew, and countless others who might get caught in the crossfire. The back door of the house loomed ahead, and Raven, as usual, took the lead. She was quick, silent, and precise. Within moments, She had picked the lock, and the door creaked open. The team moved in, the cool night air brushing against their faces as they slipped inside. Forge's heart beat faster as they moved deeper into the house. The interior was dim, only lit by the faint light of a single bulb in the hallway. He motioned for the team to spread out and clear the rooms. His mind raced, trying to anticipate what was ahead. Every sense was heightened. Every footstep felt like it echoed through the house. They had to move fast. If Waller was here, they couldn't afford to waste any time. Raven gave a quick signal that the first floor was clear. Forge nodded, signaling for them to head upstairs. As they crept up, Forge's hand instinctively rested on his weapon. The second floor was quieter, but it didn't feel safe. They had to be careful. The leader's instincts told him something wasn't right. He could almost feel eyes on him, watching, waiting. They reached the top of the stairs, and Forge signaled for everyone to stop. The hallway ahead was dark, but faint voices could be heard coming from the end. "Stay close," he whispered to Storm, who nodded in acknowledgement. They moved down the hallway, taking cover at each corner. The voices were getting louder, clearer. Forge could make out snippets of the conversation. "I told you, we need to move fast. Waller's orders are clear. If the bikers show up, we have to deal with them immediately." Forge's heart skipped a beat. These were Waller's men. They were talking about him, about them. His mind flashed back to the conversation he had overheard in the warehouse. They knew they were coming. They had been waiting for them. As they moved closer, Forge could hear the sound of something heavy being moved, a chair scraping across the floor. He motioned for the group to get into position. "Ready?" he whispered to Storm. Storm's face was calm, but his eyes told a different story. He was ready. Forge nodded, taking a deep breath. "On my count. 3, 2, 1. He kicked the door open, and the bikers stormed in, weapons drawn, ready for a fight. The room was dimly lit, but Forge could see everything clearly. 3 men stood around a table, their eyes widening as they saw the bikers burst through the door. The leader, a tall man with a scarred face, reached for his gun, but Forge was faster. In one smooth motion, Forge had his weapon trained on the man's chest. "Don't even think about it," Forge said, his voice cold. The man froze, his hand still hovering over the gun. "You don't want this fight." The man sneered, his eyes full of defiance. "You think you can just waltz in here and take down Waller's men? You have no idea what you're up against." Forge's eyes narrowed. "We've heard enough. Where's Waller?" The man chuckled darkly. "You really don't know, do you? Waller's already made his move. You've been chasing ghosts this whole time." A cold chill ran down Forge's spine as the man's words sank in. Waller was already ahead of them. He had planned this from the start. "You're too late," the man continued, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Waller's already gone." Forge's mind raced. They were running out of time. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. "You're not going anywhere," Forge said, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Tell me where he is, or things are going to get a lot worse for you." The man's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think I'll talk? You're wasting your time. You don't have the power to stop him." "Try me," Forge muttered. But before he could press further, a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by the sound of multiple engines revving outside. Forge's heart sank. Reinforcements were arriving. They had to act, and fast. "Everyone out. Now," he shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. The bikers rushed to the door, and Forge followed close behind. As they reached the front of the house, they saw a convoy of black SUVs pulling up to the driveway, followed by dozens of men on motorcycles. Waller's backup had arrived, and they were ready for a fight. The sound of engines grew louder as the convoy of SUVs and motorcycles closed in. Forge's heart pounded in his chest as he motioned for his crew to take cover behind the building. But there was no escaping what was coming. The battle that had seemed inevitable now loomed large. Royce Waller and his men were here. Forge could feel the heat of the moment. The stakes had risen far beyond what he had imagined when he first decided to take on the criminals who had been terrorizing the city. They weren't just after the woman and her daughter anymore. They were now hunting him and his crew. The bikers quickly organized, each of them taking a position as they prepared for what was about to unfold. Forge stood at the forefront, his mind sharp. He had faced threats before, but this felt different. Waller's men were well-equipped, and they had numbers on their side. Forge knew they had to fight smart. "We don't have much time," Forge said, his voice low but commanding. They're coming in hot. We hold them off here, and we make our move when the opportunity presents itself. No one gets left behind. Raven, who had always been the one to think ahead, nodded. We've got the advantage of surprise. They don't know we're ready. Exactly, Forge replied. We don't need to take them all down. Just enough to get out and get the answers we need. We move fast, hit hard, and get out. No unnecessary risks. The sound of tires screeching to a halt echoed through the night air as the convoy arrived. The men on motorcycles quickly dismounted, their heavy boots hitting the ground with a loud thud. Forge could see them spread out, forming a perimeter around the house. They were ready for a fight. Stay low, Forge whispered to his crew as he watched the men approach. The seconds felt like hours as the bikers waited, each of them knowing what was coming next. A shout rang out from one of the men outside. Spread out. Find them. They're here somewhere. Forge's grip tightened around the handle of his weapon. This was the moment. With a sharp command, Forge and his team sprang into action, storming out of their cover and charging the group of men that had surrounded the house. The first man didn't even have time to react before Forge tackled him to the ground, knocking the wind out of him. Move now, Forge shouted. The rest of the team followed suit, overwhelming the men in a wave of leather and steel. Gunfire erupted in the night, the sound of bullets tearing through the air filling the space around them. The team fought fiercely, their experience and training guiding every move. Forge's mind was in overdrive, calculating every action, every step. He could hear the chaos unfolding around him, but his focus never wavered. His primary goal was clear: get the answers they needed and stop Waller from escaping. As the fight raged on, Forge's eyes darted across the battlefield. He spotted one of Waller's men trying to escape, ducking behind the trees and heading toward the SUV. Without hesitation, Forge sprinted toward him, his legs pushing him faster than he thought possible. The man was almost at the vehicle when Forge caught up, slamming him into the side of the SUV with a force that knocked the breath out of him. Where's Waller? Forge demanded, his voice a low growl. The man struggled beneath him, trying to break free, but Forge's grip was ironclad. Tell me where he is. The man spat in his face, but Forge didn't flinch. You're not walking away from this, Forge said, his tone cold and unyielding. Tell me where Waller is. The man finally let out a sigh of defeat. He's gone, he muttered, his voice filled with contempt. You're too late. Waller's already gone into hiding. You'll never find him. Forge's blood ran cold as the man's words sank in. Waller had escaped, slipping through their fingers once again. But Forge wasn't about to give up. He lifted the man off the ground, holding him close. Where is he? Forge demanded, his voice rising. The man smirked. I won't tell you. You're wasting your time. Waller's untouchable. Forge's patience snapped. With one swift motion, he slammed the man's head against the side of the SUV. The man groaned, but didn't speak. Forge's mind raced, trying to piece together the clues. Waller had planned for this. He had known they would come for him, and now he was somewhere, hidden, far away. This isn't over, Forge muttered under his breath. The fight continued around him as the team pushed back Waller's men. But Forge's mind wasn't focused on the battle at hand. He needed to find Waller, and he needed to do it fast. As the last of Waller's men were subdued, Forge turned to his crew. We've got to move, he said urgently. Waller's gone, but we're not done yet. We're going after him, no matter where he's hiding. The bikers nodded, their resolve hardening. They weren't walking away from this. The war had just begun, and they were all in, no matter what it took. The sound of retreating engines filled the air as Forge and his team stood in the aftermath of the fight. Waller's men had been subdued, but the air still buzzed with tension. The mission had shifted from a simple rescue to something far more dangerous. Waller had slipped through their grasp, and now they had no choice but to hunt him down. The crew gathered around Forge, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. He's gone, Storm said, his voice tight with frustration. We were so close, but he managed to slip away. Forge nodded, his mind racing. He knew we were coming. He's always been one step ahead. The team remained silent for a moment, each of them digesting the reality of what had just happened. They had fought hard, pushed their limits, and now Waller was out there, somewhere. The fight wasn't over. We can't let him get away, Forge said, his voice sharp. We'll track him down, no matter what it takes. This isn't just about taking him down anymore. It's about stopping the whole operation. Raven stepped forward, her eyes hard with resolve. I've got some contacts who might know where he's hiding. We don't have time to waste. Forge's gaze was intense, unwavering. Do it. Get us that information. The group moved swiftly, the urgency clear in their every action. As Raven made her calls, Forge's mind raced with plans and strategies. He knew Waller wasn't acting alone. The operation was vast, and it stretched farther than they had ever imagined. But the bikers weren't backing down. Not now. Not when they were so close. It didn't take long for Raven to return with news. I've got a lead, she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. Waller's connected to a network of operations. Arms deals, trafficking, you name it. And I've got a location. It's a compound on the outskirts of town, heavily guarded. Forge's heart pounded. How do we get in? We go in fast, hit them hard. We don't give them time to react, Raven replied. It's the only way we'll catch them off guard. The plan was set. The bikers suited up, their minds focused, knowing this was their best shot at ending the operation for good. They mounted their bikes and revved the engines, the sound echoing through the quiet night. As they made their way toward the compound, Forge's thoughts were clear. He wasn't going to let Waller slip through his fingers again. The bikers arrived at the outskirts of the compound, the air heavy with anticipation. The compound itself was massive, surrounded by high fences and watchtowers. But Forge wasn't intimidated. He had faced worse. We hit them hard, no hesitation, Forge said, his voice low but filled with authority. The team nodded in agreement. There was no turning back now. They were going in. The bikers moved quickly, circling the compound to avoid detection. The sound of their engines was muffled by the thick trees and the isolation of the area. Forge led the charge, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. As they reached the perimeter, Raven motioned for them to stop. We need to take out the guards before we make our move, she said, her voice calm but decisive. They're scattered along the fence line, but they'll be on alert soon. We need to act fast. Forge nodded. Storm, you and Raven take the left side. The rest of you with me. We'll cover the front. With a final look, they moved out, silently and swiftly. The guards were unsuspecting, too focused on their posts to notice the bikers creeping toward them. In seconds, the first group of guards was down, and the bikers moved inside. They were now in the heart of the compound. The tension was palpable. Forge could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as they advanced. The team moved quickly, clearing rooms, taking down anyone who got in their way. The sound of gunfire and shouts filled the air, but Forge's focus never wavered. His eyes were locked on the building ahead, the place where he knew Waller was hiding. They reached the building where Waller was supposed to be. Forge kicked the door open, his team following close behind. Inside, a small group of armed men was gathered, their eyes wide with shock as they saw the bikers storm in. Get down, one of the men shouted, but it was too late. The bikers were upon them, taking them down one by one. Forge pushed forward, his weapon ready, his heart pounding with anticipation. And then, at the far end of the room, Forge saw him, Royce Waller. The man who had been pulling the strings, the man who had been hiding in the shadows. Waller looked up, his eyes narrowing as he saw Forge. You, Waller said, his voice cold. I should have known you'd show up. Forge stepped forward, his expression hard. It's over, Waller. You're not getting away this time. Waller smirked, a dangerous glint in his eyes. You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with. He made a swift movement, reaching for a hidden weapon, but Forge was faster. In one motion, he tackled Waller to the ground, pinning him down. You're done, Forge said, his voice cold and steady. You're not running anymore. Waller struggled beneath him, but Forge held him down. We're taking you in. And this time, there's no escaping. The room fell silent as the rest of the bikers rounded up the remaining men. The operation was over. Waller's reign of terror had come to an end. But Forge knew this was just the beginning. There were more out there, more people like Waller. But for now, the team had won, and they would make sure no one else would fall victim to the shadows. The sun was beginning to rise as the bikers loaded the last of the prisoners into the back of the van. The sound of the engine hummed in the background, but for Forge, it was more than just the noise. It was a reminder that the mission wasn't over. They had captured Royce Waller, but the damage had already been done. The criminal network he had been running was still out there, and as far as Forge could tell, This was just one small victory in a much larger battle. The team had made sure to clear the compound, securing the perimeter before they left. As they rode out of the area, the leader's mind was focused on the next step. Waller would have answers. He would have connections. And most importantly, Forge needed to know who else was behind all of this. He wasn't done yet. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice over the comms. "Forge, we've got a problem." It was Raven. She had been running point for the operation, keeping an eye on things. "What's going on?" Forge asked, his voice steady but tense. "We've got some intel," Raven said, her voice calm but urgent. Turns out, Waller wasn't just the top dog in this operation. He was working with some pretty heavy hitters. "The network runs deeper than we thought. And there's one more thing. There's another group, operating under a different name. They're looking for you, Forge." Forge's stomach tightened. "How do they know about us?" he asked, the question hanging in the air. Raven was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. But they've got eyes on you. They've been tracking your movements, ever since we took down the last group." Forge's mind raced. "What's their plan?" Raven's voice crackled over the line. "They're coming for you. They know who you are, and they're not stopping until they take you down. They've been waiting for a chance to make their move." Forge clenched his jaw. "They won't get the chance," he muttered under his breath. He turned to the team, his voice firm. "We need to move fast. If they're after us, we can't afford to wait. We need to find out who these people are, and we need to hit them before they hit us." As the bikers sped down the highway, Forge's thoughts were on the battle ahead. He could feel the tension rising again, but this time it was different. The stakes had been raised. It wasn't just about stopping one man. It was about taking down a whole operation. The group headed for a safe location, a secluded area outside of town where they could regroup and plan their next move. Forge knew it was only a matter of time before their enemies made their move. But he wasn't going to let them catch him off guard. The team arrived at their destination, and Forge immediately took charge, giving quick orders to the crew. "Get inside, secure the perimeter. No one gets in or out without us knowing. Raven, I need you to keep digging into this new group. Find out who they are, what they want, and how we can take them down." Raven nodded, already pulling out her phone and making calls. Forge turned to the others. "We stay on alert. If they're coming for us, we'll be ready. We don't let them take the initiative." As the team settled in, Forge's mind continued to race. They had stopped Waller, but that was just a piece of the puzzle. Whoever was behind this new group had the resources to track them, to anticipate their every move. That meant they were powerful. That meant they weren't just a random set of criminals. They were organized, methodical, and they had been preparing for this fight. Forge knew this wasn't going to be easy. They couldn't just keep reacting. They needed to take control of the situation, and fast. Hours passed as the team fortified their position, checking their weapons, preparing for whatever came next. Raven returned with more information. "I've got some names," she said. "They go by the name of the Serpents. They're an old-school gang with deep connections in the underground world. Arms dealers, human traffickers, you name it. And they've got a lot of muscle. They're dangerous." Forge's eyes narrowed. "The Serpents," he muttered. "I've heard of them. Never thought they'd come after us." Raven nodded. "They've been watching you. They're not just interested in you. They're interested in taking everything down, everything you've built." Forge clenched his fists, his mind racing with the possibilities. The Serpents weren't just after the bikers. They were after everything. They wanted to tear apart the community, break down the network Forge had worked so hard to protect. And they were willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. "We can't let them win," Forge said, his voice filled with resolve. "We take them out before they can take us down." The team nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for everything they had worked for. The war was far from over, and now, more than ever, Forge knew that the only way to win was to stay one step ahead. And he would, no matter what it took. The night had fallen heavy, and the air around the bikers' base was thick with anticipation. Forge stood at the front, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just another fight. This was the final battle. The Serpents were coming for everything they had built, and Forge wasn't about to let them take it. He glanced over at his crew, each one of them armed, determined, and ready. They had been through hell together, and this time, they weren't going to let anything stop them. "This is it," Forge said, his voice low but filled with a sense of finality. "We take them down tonight, or we don't walk away." The rest of the team nodded, their expressions hard. They knew what was at stake. The Serpents had proven that they would do anything to tear the bikers down, and Forge wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. He motioned for the group to mount their bikes. The engines roared to life as they sped toward the location where the Serpents had set up camp. As they neared the compound, Forge could see the flickering lights of the enemy's camp in the distance. This was the moment they had been preparing for. They had no intention of letting the Serpents get away. Forge signaled for the team to spread out and surround the area. They had to hit hard and fast before the Serpents even knew what was happening. Forge led the charge, his bike cutting through the night air like a knife. The sound of their engines echoed through the trees, a reminder that they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for everything they had built. As they reached the edge of the compound, Forge's eyes scanned the area. The Serpents had made camp in a clearing, the glow of their campfires casting long shadows across the ground. But the bikers weren't fooled by the quiet. Forge knew the Serpents were waiting for them, and they would be ready for whatever came next. "Move out," Forge commanded, his voice sharp and unwavering. They didn't hesitate. They surged forward, weapons drawn, their eyes locked on their target. As they stormed into the compound, gunfire erupted from the shadows. The Serpents had been waiting for them, but the bikers were faster, more precise. They took down the first wave of attackers with ease, their experience and coordination giving them the upper hand. Forge's mind was a blur of adrenaline and strategy. He knew they couldn't waste any time. They had to get to the heart of the compound, where Waller was hiding, and end this once and for all. He spotted one of the Serpent leaders near the back of the compound, his eyes scanning the chaos around him. Forge didn't waste a second. He charged forward, cutting through the line of enemies with ruthless efficiency. The man spotted him just as Forge reached him, his face twisting in a mixture of surprise and rage. "You think you can take us down?" the man sneered, reaching for his weapon. But Forge was already on him, knocking the gun from his hand and slamming him into the ground. "This ends tonight," Forge growled, pinning the man beneath him. The Serpent leader struggled, but Forge's grip was ironclad. "Where's Waller?" Forge demanded, his voice low but filled with fury. The man glared at him, but Forge wasn't backing down. "Tell me now." The leader's expression faltered, and he let out a defeated sigh. "You're too late," he spat. "Waller's gone. He's already moved. You'll never catch him now." Forge's heart skipped a beat. They had been chasing Waller for days, and now he had slipped away once again. But Forge wasn't going to give up. Not now. "Where did he go?" Forge pressed, his voice colder than ice. "Tell me." The leader's eyes flickered with fear, but he refused to speak. Forge tightened his grip, squeezing harder. "You're not leaving here until I have answers." The man finally broke, his voice trembling. "He's in the city. He's hiding in plain sight. But you won't find him. You're too far behind." The words hit Forge like a freight train. Waller was in the city. He had been right under their noses this entire time. Forge stood up, his mind racing. The Serpent leader's face was twisted in pain, but Forge didn't care. He had the information he needed. "Get the rest of them," Forge ordered, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The bikers moved quickly, securing the remaining Serpents. But Forge wasn't focused on them anymore. His eyes were locked on the city, his mind already planning the next move. They were so close now. He wasn't going to let Waller escape again. "We're going to the city," Forge said, his voice filled with determination. "We're taking him down, once and for all." The team mounted their bikes, engines roaring to life once again. They were no longer just a group of bikers fighting for survival. They were a force to be reckoned with, and nothing, not even Waller and his network, was going to stop them now. The road ahead was uncertain, but Forge knew one thing for sure. They were going to find Waller, and they were going to make sure he never hurt anyone again. In this gripping tale, we dive deep into the world of intense action and unyielding loyalty. Hell Angels stories often reveal the grit and raw power behind a brotherhood of rebels who fight against a corrupt system. As the biker gang faces off against dangerous enemies, the leader, Forge, must confront powerful criminal networks, including the notorious Serpents and their leader, Royce Waller. As the story unfolds, Forge and his crew learn that their fight is far from over. Waller, a man who has been pulling the strings in the shadows, has evaded capture time and time again. These Hell Angels stories not only showcase the battles on the streets, but also the personal stakes of each biker, with Forge determined to protect the innocent and bring down Waller's empire. Their journey takes them through chaotic confrontations and moments of extreme danger, highlighting the brotherhood that binds them together. The relentless pursuit of justice in these Hell Angels stories is a testament to the courage and strength of those who refuse to back down. With each victory and loss, the bikers push forward, knowing that their greatest challenge is still ahead. In a world where loyalty is everything, Forge and his team must overcome obstacles that threaten to tear them apart, but their resolve only grows stronger. These Hell Angels stories are about far more than just bikes and leather. They explore themes of family, justice, and the constant battle against those who would see the world burn. As the stakes rise, the bikers are ready to face whatever comes next, proving that no enemy is too strong when you fight with everything you've got.